Welcome to part one of your French and Indian War notes. I kind of separated them so that this is the beginning half, but there's also a later half too. So we're just talking about the setup of the war and really what happened and how it changed America. Let's see. This is kind of a rough map of what the North American territories looked like at the beginning of the war. The English colonies basically hugged the east coast of North America. France had this huge section in the middle of the continent. Basically, though, the French only settled in this area here and down here in what is now New Orleans. And of course, you have the Spanish over here, but the Spanish don't play too much of a role in the French and Indian War. At the end of the war, this map is going to look a lot different, and we'll show a comparative map at the end of the second set of notes. Okay, so we're going to start off talking about rising tensions, right? And don't forget, the French and Indian War is between France and Great Britain. It's not the French versus the Indians, which is a trick question on an upcoming exam. So a rivalry was growing between France and Great Britain as they both tried to expand into each other's territories. British fur traders were looking into the Ohio River Valley, but the French already had some forts in the area. Likewise, the French were looking to expand their fur trade into areas of New York and Maine, both of which were claimed by Britain. So you have kind of unclear borders, and it led to some intrusion by both the British and the French into these areas. Small local battles began to break out among the British colonists and the French traders. Here's a quick little video that's just going to demonstrate kind of the setup of the war. And it's pretty short, so let's get started.
That is largely empty and up for grabs. Both France and Britain set their sights on one spot in particular. A strategic river junction called the Forks of the Ohio, where Pittsburgh stands today. But the forks of the Ohio isn't theirs for the taking. The native people consider this their land and not something that can be traded or sold. But there is one Indian leader in the region who...
Okay, I understand, guys, that was really quick, but I just want to give you a quick little setup as to where the actual area was, and the fact that, really it's not just about the British and the French. There are Native Americans living in that region as well. So, about the Native Americans, most tribes sided with the French simply because if you think way back to when we talked about the different colonial powers in North America, the French had the best relationship with the Indians, used them as trading partners, and so they didn't wish to really start any conflict with them. They liked the idea that they could kind of keep their lands and trade with them. The French didn't want to take over their lands or change their customs. So the Huron, Algonquin, Abenaki Indians all sided with the French. Okay? Indians often raided British settlements and assisted the French in some military efforts. So for the most part, though, 90%, maybe more of the Indian tribes all sided with the French in this conflict. All right, so the rivalry between the British and the French that developed in North America was mostly over what? Was it land for fur trade, disputes over Native Americans, independence, or land for development? Okay, and the answer then should be A. Okay, so the Iroquois. The most powerful Native American tribe at that time was the Iroquois. The Iroquois was located in present-day upstate New York in this area here. But however, their power and influence really stretched beyond that. All Native Americans from North America would have at least known of them. They were incredibly powerful and had far-reaching traditions and customs everyone would have known. So it's made up of a confederacy of 5 tribes. They are the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, and the Oneida Indians. They stayed out of the war at first. Both sides try to kind of smooth the Iroquois because they know that by far they're the most powerful, and whoever has them on their side, it's really going to help them win the war. So eventually they decide to join on the British side, right? And so this kind of changes the balance of power to Britain's favor, right? With the French and all the Native Americans, Britain was kind of looking at a no-win situation. But But when the Iroquois decide to side with the English, it really kind of balances the scales for the upcoming war. So, George Washington in his first command, so we're talking about George Washington for the first time, he is sent to this Ohio River Valley to push the French out. The Ohio River Valley is a junction of the Monongahela, Allegheny, and Ohio rivers, and it's really fertile land, great area. So the French are there, but the British want it. So they send George Washington in. He's not successful, okay? So in George Washington's first command, he's actually a failure. He doesn't succeed. So he returns later to the fort, or to the area, to build a British fort. But the French were already building a fort there, calling it Fort Duquesne. They took Washington and his men captive, but later released him. When Washington came home, he was a hero, even though he failed. So let that be a lesson, guys. If you ever fail, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're down and out for the rest of your life. It's this failure that led him to be famous, because people thought, wow, look at this young general. He went out to the middle of nowhere and stood up to the French. So clashes like this continued. The colonists and the French, the colonists called this conflict the French and Indian War, because they were fighting two enemies at once, the French and the Indians. Okay, and on this next slide here, I have just a quick little graphic here to kind of demonstrate to you how this went. So at the beginning, right, this is the Ohio River Valley. Like I said, it's made up of the three rivers. It all comes together. So the British came in under the command of George Washington, right? And when they're on their way, they kind of march in here, and the French stop them, okay? And they get turned back, okay? But then they come back again with Washington again to build the fort, but the French are already building Fort Duquesne, okay? He gets captured, and later he gets released. So you see multiple times the British trying to come in and out of the area, but they're unsuccessful. And more on that later. So, which is the only Native American tribe to side with the British? Is it the Abenaki, the Iroquois, the Algonquin, or the Huron? Okay, and as we talked, right, the Abenaki, Algonquin, and Huron all sided with the French, but it's the Iroquois that sided with the British. All right, so war is declared. Now, one thing that's important to know is that eventually the French and the English do go to war, but it's not just in North America. Technically, this war is called the 7 Years' War. The French Indian War is just kind of the North American part of the overall French and Indian War. France was fighting England in Europe, in Cuba, in India, in the Philippines. So in a sense, it's a world war. It's a global war. Everywhere the French and the English had colonies near each other, they were fighting for control of the land. The French learned to fight like their allies, the Native Americans, who used ambushes known as guerrilla warfare. So they used sneak attacks, and the system of using all these sneak attacks was known as guerrilla warfare. We'll talk much more about this in class. The American colonists had little help from the British army defending themselves from the French and the Indians. The colonists thought, hey, we're trading partners with you, we're making you lots of money, we're here, we're loyal to the king, help us, please. And really their calls at the beginning went largely unanswered. Many colonists became very angry at their lack of support from the mother company, and it really leads to some tension. It's the first time you start to see some tension between the colonists and England back home. Okay, and how successful was George Washington during the French and Indian War? Really, your answer should be either not at all or somewhat, right? To say very would be probably incorrect. Somewhat successful because he gains fame, sure, but his military campaign to take the Ohio River Valley is not successful. Okay, and how did the French and Indians fight differently from the British? They didn't use guns, they used sneak attacks. The French used a navy. Okay, well, really the way that they fought that was different is that they used the sneak attacks, okay? Yeah, the French had a navy, but they weren't using it with the Native Americans, and they didn't use guns isn't really true. The French had guns, and by this point, the French allies would have given their guns to the Native Americans to use as well. Okay, and that actually is it for today. We're going to do the second half for your next set of notes, and that'll really give you the outcome in what happens with the French and Indian War. Thanks, guys. Don't forget margins and reflection.